I'm Ned Lamont from Connecticut, and I'm really the warm-up man for Phil Scott, who's really on the front line of what disasters are and what governors have to do. I mean, a lot of people can determine what battles they want to take on. Governors, the battles come to us, and I think we've learned that the hard way as governors over the last 4 years, and I think Phil is right on the front lines there as well. When Phil and I first, got elected, one of the first things we did was a tabletop exercise when it came to a cyber attack. We thought it was going to take down part of a power plant in Massachusetts, if memory serves, and how the rest of us were going to respond. But then it was, just 6 months later that got hit by COVID. We had to learn how to work together, not just across disciplines within our own state, but throughout the entire region and the country as a whole. And that's what we've got to learn going forward. It's amazing. We got Juliette Kayyem here. She's got a very happy book. It's called The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters. And will tell us a little bit about how we ought to be thinking about what happens next. But Phil, I just want to say our hearts go out to you and the people of Vermont. I've heard from my friends in Ludlow what happened there. Sort of interesting. I know we've got 8 people up there in terms of a maritime rescue support. I sort of asked, how does that work? And with the mutual aid, there was an online request that was put forward by Vermont and their emergency response people. States throughout the region, responded. We were able to make our proposal and get people up there in 24 hours. And that's what mutual aid means, and that's how we look out for each other. Phil, over to you, my friend.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ned. And maybe I'll just give you a little update on where we are. And right now I'm in a separate office. Our offices are impacted as well. Our Department of Motor Vehicle, our tax, the Attorney General, Treasurer, and so forth, all our offices are closed at this point in time and flooded. I spent many hours over the last 3 years with daily pandemic press briefings, and we had a theater down in the offices that we are in, that we gave those, and that's filled with like 20 feet of water right now. So again, we're living this day in and day out. I really wanted to thank the other governors who are here today and who are not, but for helping us in many different ways. You mentioned the Swiftwater Rescue. We've had teams from 6 states thus far. We've made 200 rescues to date in climbing. This was different. Ned, you mentioned Ludlow. Ludlow has been incredibly impacted by this event, and we've seen that before during Irene. That was like 11 years ago, but this is different. With Irene, we had that storm on a Sunday afternoon, and by the next morning it was over. And then we went right into recovery. The sun was shining and a lot of damage. And we just closed out the last bridge a year ago. So that was different. This one has been raining, it rained for days, and it didn't stop. And we're impacted again. It slowed down yesterday. We had sunshine. And now today we're expecting another 2 inches of rain this afternoon, hail, lightning, a possibility of a tornado in Vermont, if you can imagine that. So climate change is real, and we're dealing with it as we speak. But again, 6 states sent those Swiftwater rescue teams to us, and we're forever grateful for that, and that's what makes this all worth it, and that's what makes this discussion worth it. My home itself was impacted, or the roads to it. I'm walking in and out on a snowmobile trail every morning. I go out a half mile, and then at night come back in another half mile. So I get my exercise in, and we'll see when the roads get repaired so I can get home. But we're displaced everywhere, but we're coming together, and we'll get through this. So again, Ned, I thank you for your service and why we're doing what we're doing. We try to bring you something interesting and relevant, and within the areas of the task force, we're asked to cover. And it really doesn't matter whether you've been in office for 7 months or 7 years. We hope this session is thought-provoking and tells you a little bit how our state governments have to be ready for everything and anything. And we have to react to increasing numbers of unpredictable challenges, again, like the one we're facing in Vermont right now. Now, look, every governor comes face to face with multiple crises. I know you know that, I know that, that's a given. But today, the pace of these incidents and therefore the number of responses is increasing. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, so we can better understand it and continue to get the job done and move our states and our nation forward. But we need to level set this. When we're talking about crises, we're not just talking about responding to a natural disaster or a global pandemic. We're also talking about a growing number of cybersecurity attacks and breaches at our hospitals, our schools, and the electrical grid as well. It could also be targeted violence or even the threat of it, like what we're seeing in schools throughout the country, and we've experienced in Vermont as well, those mass swatting events. It could be also the introduction of AI, deepfakes, or other technology-driven criminal activity or espionage. Or it could be a major transportation incident, like a collapsed bridge. I know the governor of Pennsylvania has experienced that as well. We never know when we'll be called upon to assess a situation and then provide leadership and direction. And when we all see the volume of these increasing, it gives us a pause. So with that in mind, let's talk about it. To kick us off, I'd like to formally introduce our distinguished guests, Juliette and Kayyem. Juliette is an international leader in crisis management and security. She's the faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Global Health Projects at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And prior to her time at Harvard, Juliette served as an assistant secretary in the Department of Homeland Security for President Obama and as Homeland Security advisor to former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. You may also recognize her, as I have, as a national security analyst for CNN. And if that wasn't enough, she's also a Pulitzer Prize finalist and author of that pleasant book that Ned had mentioned, Learning to Live in an Age of Disaster. Devil Never Sleeps. Can't wait to get that on my bedstand. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, Juliette, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Governor. I'm sorry you couldn't be here, but you know your role, and thank you, Governor Lamont and the team at NGA. So I have had considerable experience in government and now in academia, thinking about disasters and homeland security and from different perches, states where you are, and territories, of course, and the federal government. So take these as someone with a lot of opinions and no authority, speaking to people with both, and where we are and where we need to be. And since I do have a captive audience, there are 6 ideas I want to throw out to you all about where I think in particular governors play a significant role in the age that we find ourselves in. Okay, so you're going to hear words like polycrisis. Some people use permacrisis. What does it mean? It just means lots of bad things are happening simultaneously, and they're not defined by the particular threat. You know, you've had the pandemic and school shootings and cyber attacks and climate disasters, and the way we think about that is just sort of you're having multiple overlapping shocks. That's what polycrisis means. And it means that the whole is more dangerous than the parts, right? It's not like you're just bouncing back. These things keep coming. And so we're sort of setting a floor each time, right? That then becomes our norm, even though more disasters or crises are coming. I tend to call it the boom moment because I don't like to define it based on risk. I think the moment that you find yourself in terms of crisis management, it's everything. It's the devil, so to speak. You are going to be facing different kinds of booms at different, both expected and unexpected. The framework that you all have inherited, the state emergency management, disaster management framework, was built in the 1970s and has not had tremendous reform, despite the fact all the things that keep changing. That framework was based on the notion that disasters were random and rare, right? There's an acute crisis, everyone runs to it, you set up an incident command structure, the locals respond, the states then manage it, help manage, and then you turn to the feds for additional support. In my world and thinking about disaster management, we call that sort of thinking a sort of left and right of boom, right? So think about the boom could be anything. Left is all the prevention and preparedness things that you do. Right is then response, recovery, and resiliency. And we thought about it as binary, right? There was a moment before and a moment after. Well, now it's circular. You're feeling that, right? And the doctrine has not changed. The way we think about it has not changed. Your teams are ill-equipped and understaffed, not their fault. They're working hard for this circle, right? This circle of mayhem, call it whatever you want. We define, and it's important to remember that we define crises as very different than I think the public policy issues that you're addressing today. Lots of things are crises. There's a mental health crisis. There's the difference that you're engaged in or that you encounter at this moment of boom is it has three elements. So thinking about how are you preparing yourself? It's a disruption to your core capabilities as a governor, as a state, as a community leader. That comes at a time that's unexpected. I'm looking at Governor Shapiro, right? Just okay, that truck caught on fire. Good morning. And third, and this is the most important piece, your runway is short. I teach at a school of public policy, so we do think of public policy challenges, which may be crises, mental health, housing, poverty, as very different than the kind that you're experiencing. So hopefully, as you think about how you're preparing yourselves and your teams, think about that short runway at that moment of boom. That's all you got. And so you only have two options: be ready, right, because the runway is coming, or try to extend the runway. Those are your only two options at that moment. And so I'm gonna hopefully provide some ways to think about that runway. And I describe in the book and in my work, just sort of think about learning to fail safer. It's not a happy place to be, I recognize that. You know, it's like we sort of don't get to good, we're just getting to less bad. But that's important to your communities and to the people you represent. Because you represent, how are we gonna get to less bad? Because at that moment of boom, it's bad. And it's bad for people who are looking to government to work, right? They may, whatever their ideology is, this is the moment they want it to work. So what are 6 ways that I think about in terms of the commonalities across disasters? So my work, I don't look at a particular one and say, here are the lessons, the centuries of disasters that provide us with these commonalities. So right now, when you go back, the first thing, the most important thing I think that makes leadership significant is, what is your situational awareness at the moment of the boom? And are you happy with it, right? It is amazing at that moment, right? People in your leadership positions are either not getting the information that they want in a timely fashion, or are getting it in such a sort of limited way that you're not. I often say, you know, it's easy, people will criticize all the time for you all, but in a disaster particularly, a lot of times there's wisdom in that noise. And you want to capture it, whether it's communities that don't support you or communities that may be antagonistic to you. They're noisy because often they don't have a seat at the table. So if you can capture that, right, you are going to be able to deploy resources and have your teams deploy resources in ways that there might be wisdom in that noise. It's not just criticism, that people have not traditionally had seats at tables. Our disaster management system is not always equitable. One way that that's being done in some states and so I want to give you examples from your peers so you could talk about it, is these community emergency support functions. You're familiar with emergency support functions because that's how your emergency management teams work. And they're about logistics and transportation, everything else. Actually, why don't you build one for community engagement? Right, it's as important at the time of disaster as logistics and planning. Second, communications. Obviously, that's your big role, and you could take classes and classes on crisis communication. I want to make it easy for you. Numbers and hope. If you look at some of your predecessors, Bobby Jindal in particular, you cannot delegate knowledge of what is going on to others. And Governor, I just was recently watching you. So what is happening? What are the numbers telling you, right? Just basic facts people want. And then your role is hope. Right? What are you doing to make government at that time? People are going to give you all sorts of advice on crisis management. I just made it easier, right? If you can capture those two things, people then will feel and be invested in your success and, of course, their success. I have to add a little caveat here. And don't be afraid of tough love. In the sense that we need communities to move. We need them not to drive, as a Vermont governor, to drive into things that they think are puddles that are not puddles. We need them to evacuate. And so Governor Christie, former Governor Christie, was quite good at this, but you need to be tough, that the resources people are expecting will not come to them unless they listen. You are not going to put your emergency management teams at risk because someone fails to evacuate. Third, think about what the Haitians call stupid. Of course, these are the deaths that did not need to, deaths or destruction that did not need to happen. The Haitians think about this: an earthquake happens, but then another 100,000 people die because they simply cannot get resources to them. We don't have numbers like this, fortunately, but there are people who will suffer consequences, not at the immediate boom. And in some ways, you not being tactically oriented, but being strategically oriented can help guide communities to protect them for that time period between immediate response and when things calm down. Fourth, if I could have every governor have a recovery office, I would, or a recovery czar. I don't worry about response as much. I mean, there's challenges to you. Emergency compacts don't work if 50 states are activated to fight COVID. We know that, right? We know that you're being stretched, but there's sort of ingenuity at that moment of the boom. Everyone leaves at recovery. And states can help communities think long-term, not just about, what resources are we going to get you at the moment of the mayhem, but obviously when the cameras leave, when the focus leaves. And I think that's a particularly unique and important role for governors' offices. Communities can't do it on their own. The resources sort of disappear. And helping communities do that. So you're just seeing a lot more focus on, between response and long-term resiliency. There's those months and years, think about New Orleans, of recovery that no one owns. And I really think it's an important role for governors who can capture all of the aspects of state government and drive them to communities that are harmed. Fifth, another area that's important is communities will get defensive about their response. That's just inevitable. Every disaster has politics. Give me a disaster that doesn't have politics, and I'll show you to North Korea. I mean, politics are the bloodstream of our democracy, but we need to learn as well, outside of all the screaming and yelling and the root causes, and is it climate change and gun control, all that stuff just put aside. That an important part of what states can do, and governors and territories and governors, is learn, as we say in our vernacular, not that they die, but how they died. Those are different questions, right? You can say, 4 dozen people died in this hurricane, right? And a community will, sort of recognize that. But only a state, I think, can take a sort of series after action review on what happened, because we learn different things when we study what happened and how people die is different. So one example is in the United States and Puerto Rico, is still suffering the consequences. But in the continental United States, when we say people die from a hurricane, they are not dying from water, right? Most of them are now dying from carbon monoxide poisoning because people put makeshift generators up and then those makeshift generators don't work and there's all sort of do-it-yourself stuff. Well, knowing that will help you drive your resources in terms of how are you educating communities and other aspects like that. So your role as a sort of reviewer or after action, like a military general, is really, really important because then you can drive your resources to the how people are dying, right? What is going on? And then finally, incentivizing resilience. This is the hardest thing. If disasters are a circle, our framework, you know this, you work with the Stafford Act, is not working for our communities. If something happens in your state and you're begging for dollars to get the community back, not able statutorily to think long-term, right? We cannot invest in resiliency. It's just the Stafford Act is not working for us, I think, as a nation, given the recurring nature of disasters now. And for all the criticisms that we hear about insurance companies, honestly, insurance companies are just filling the gap of what public policy is unwilling to do, right? They're just trying to price risk, right? And we're not doing it. So I want to give you some good news on this. Across the states and territories, there's been some really interesting work on mitigation studies. In other words, trying to drive disaster relief money to mitigating the harm that community will face again because it's facing it again. In Louisiana, Alabama has actually partnered with its state universities to have mitigation planning, which they are then working with the insurance industry to lower premiums. It's a really sort of unique and helpful way to think about partnering with your stakeholders to try to protect your communities. Louisiana similarly has a grant mitigation fund that they are driving to communities to get them to after the disaster, right? So the disasters happen. Now we're going to use the funds because we know another disaster is coming. On the federal side, this is jobs, right? This is not a bad thing when you think about rebuilding. I mean, it's horrible, but when you think about what positive can come out of it. I just want to point you to some areas and get your economics teams to think about it. A lot of this mitigation and resiliency stuff is being hidden. Not bad, I think, just to get out of the politics of, is it climate change? Is this a climate change statute? In the Farm Bill, obviously, farmers are suffering. There is a tremendous amount of funding for mitigation. In the Inflation Act, of course, there is efforts to support states in their mitigation planning. But there are changes at FEMA that you should be aware of. And honestly, I can't ask you to lobby, but honestly, express your support. These are going to help your states. Two minor changes to the Stafford Act that gets us out of that cycle of bad thing happens, let's throw money at the problem, get you back to normal, and oh, surprise, another bad thing happens. So think about two areas where there have been changes. One is called the Community Disaster Resilience Zone, and that is steering money to communities that are more in need than others. You could think they're because they're already not resilient, right? Then the thing happens. So specific money for communities at need. But the other is good for you all. It is that there is now a way to think about disaster relief that goes to mitigation. Remember your 75-25% split with the Stafford Act. If communities use it to try to mitigate for the next disaster, the federal government will take on 85%, not 75%, only leaving 15% to the communities and you. It's a small program. It needs to get better, but there are ways that we're testing the system so that we're not just, disaster, throw the funds at it, and then move on and hope, keep your fingers crossed. So those are some efforts on on state level, private sector level, of course, and the federal level. It goes without saying, insurance and insurance companies have a huge role. States, as you know, you own insurance. There is no national insurance standard. The Supreme Court has spoken to that. So working with your insurance companies about what they may need in terms of reducing risk for communities. The stuff you're seeing in California and Florida is a lot of posturing, but it's also real, right? I mean, it is in the sense these risks are not being mitigated sufficiently. Okay, that is plenty, but I leave you with that. I think the new playbook's being written, and I think it is being written by the states and the territories as you recognize that we are, that these disasters are not random and rare, that the devil, never sleeps, and that you are faced with some of these challenges. So I'm happy to open it up now, but I was given 15 minutes and I had a captive audience, so those are my 6 for you, so thank you.
Hey, beautifully said, Juliette. Let's keep going on the insurance companies, if I could. We've got property and casualty in Connecticut, the Hartford Travelers. I don't want them on the sidelines pricing risk. I want them at the table. We got a fair amount of infrastructure money and resilience money. I want them to use their analytics to help us where that could best be deployed. What are other states doing? What could the feds do to help there?
Want me to? Let me ask me. Okay, so so as I said, I think what's happening in California and Florida is just, the insurance companies are trying to get a little bit more receptivity. But honestly, I mean, California has a rule now that does not let the insurance companies adapt to changing mapping. And, you either believe in this in mapping, right, as a tool to drive resources, or you don't. Now, you might not like what the insurance companies are saying, but in the absence of us doing it better, right, they're going to fill that vacuum, and they're going to decide to exit areas that are where they cannot get enough flexibility. Look, climate change, whatever you're going to call it, this is happening, and we're either going to price it now or later. And the idea that these decisions about where we live, how we live, whether we should live there, right, are being made by, as you said, by you don't want them being made by the private sector. And that's what's happening now. So bringing the insurance companies to the table, figuring out what they need in terms of mapping, get consumer protections in it, obviously. But a decision by an insurance company to simply, and it's being reported incorrectly, they didn't abandon California and Florida, they're just not writing new claims. But the decision by them to do that without any individualized risk assessment then means that the individual homeowner has no ability to mitigate their own risks. And homeowners can do it. I mean, there's an independent study about Paradise, Florida. You can debate whether people should live in the urban wildland interface, or wildland to urban interface, but they do, right? And it determined that with personal mitigation efforts by homeowners, right, but better roofing, getting rid of shrubs, it was a horrible human loss, but you could have protected about 42% of that property. So the insurance companies can incentivize this for homeowners, and states can work with insurance companies, right? Your premium's gonna be lower if you have X, Y, or Z. Now, of course, no one behaves well in the context of all of this, and people go to their corners, but I think that's where you come in, is that, this is happening. We can't pretend like it's not happening. Our public policy is being set by insurance in certain ways, or by disaster relief funds that aren't doing anything to make us safer, for these communities safer for the future. So,
Any other questions? Oh, fun, I get that.
Well,
there you go, Jared.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I mean, this was focused more on states appropriately, but let's talk about federal and FEMA for a moment.
Yeah.
My frustrations, and informally talking to other governors, some of the same, is that very often their solutions are sort of wildly out of touch with what's needed, and in fact cost federal taxpayers more. And is there some is there some new paradigm? Because I think we all agree there's a federal role in this. I mean, we're states, we're on the ground, but we need help in these kind of one-time events that are large scale. FEMA generally is not it. I mean, they come in with kind of not the right thing that, and if we had a smaller amount of funds that were more flexible, we would go a lot further. How do we kind of incorporate one of the things we all do is we advocate federally, but I mean, in your opinion, what should we be asking for in terms of reforming FEMA and a better federal response?
That is a great question. I'm sure people from FEMA who are here will have strong opinions. So first of all, their hands are legitimately tied. I mean, it is the most frustrating thing because you just talk with anyone. Everyone knows what needs to be done, but this, as I said, this was built in the 1970s. It's just not working for anyone anymore, and so some of these pushes are happening at both the FEMA level, but I should say your Homeland Security advisors are, meet as in a consortium, and one of their number one policy agendas is the Stafford Act. Everyone just knows it's not working. Your governors, your access point, I saw Tom Perez here last night. I mean, your access point is the president, right? So in other words, your emergency management teams know what to ask for in terms of FEMA and what FEMA is capable of doing. But there's a tremendous amount of federal resources outside of FEMA that you can draw on through the president and his team. And so that's an important role. I mean, the White Houses take that seriously. I've seen in my experiences in federal and state government, and ones that FEMA really isn't. So, HUD is here, and transportation. There's no unfortunately for you, there's no unified, stuff happens, we want to get everything to you. But basically the White House is the access point. The second thing I would say is, from your perspective, have a good understanding of what literal resources are available to you from FEMA, the FEMA region that you're in, because they may be unrealistic, right? I mean, FEMA is like 5,000, 6,000 FTEs. It's not an army. It's like, I mean, I love them, but its capacity is they know everyone else in the federal government. You need helicopters, I know people at DOD. You need whatever resources are, so that your demands can be specific to what they presently have. And that's pretty easy to do. You all have regional FEMA heads who are going to have a sense of what's in the other states as well. As I said, numbers and hope. Get a sense of the numbers, and then your expectations will also be set.
Pedro.
Yeah, first of all, I have to commend you about the amount of information and knowledge that you have. Experience, but wow. And so it's so hard to react to everything you've told us. One thing, so I'll try to be brief. One thing that is very hard for me to handle with communities that are located where they shouldn't be. Meaning in flood areas, we're too close to the coast. What do you do? I mean, you cannot start expropriating all over the place, or if they have title, because some of them don't even have title. And so it's a safety issue.
Yeah.
So that's hard. Now, FEMA is doing a couple of things that I think incentivize those constituents to move.
Yeah.
First, FEMA gives them public assistance, emergency public assistance, but they kind of warn them the next time around, if you don't have flood insurance, they do something like that, which, it's like a warning. It's like saying, hey, wake up. This is going to happen again. And next time I'm not going to be around. So maybe that helps. Another thing that FEMA is doing, actually, in the case of Puerto Rico, I'm not sure this applies to the states. We got hit by Hurricane Maria, which was a category 4 or 5 hurricane. This was way back 2017. Congress authorized FEMA to build back better in Puerto Rico, not simply to repair and get the infrastructure back to where it was, but actually to make it better, more resilient. So we're working on that. And that's good, actually. So if it's not happening elsewhere, it should be elsewhere. Now, one thing we need, and I'm asking for, and FEMA is telling me probably that they need a directive from Congress, so I'm also working Congress on this, is this inflation that we went through. Part of the permanent projects we are working on in Puerto Rico, a lot of them, are being done under Stafford Act Section 428. Yeah. And that section gives you more flexibility in structuring, changing the projects once you're funded, once the money's obligated. But it sets, FEMA sets a hard cap on the project. And I inherited estimates that were done in 2019. Yep. Imagine, this is 2023. And so it could be that if I got, instead of having funding for 100% of the cost of a project, now I have 80% of the cost of the project being funded. So I'm trying to convince FEMA to adjust those caps based on justified inflation impact. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm just telling you that one because maybe you can help me.
Yeah, just quickly, I actually think
that would make sense for states as well. By the way, this is not only for Puerto Rico because it's the same FEMA for all of us.
Yeah. I don't think FEMA would disagree with you. I mean, in other words, the reforms that have to take place in the doctrine that they're tied to are going to have to come from their constituents, right, which is all of you, right, because, and that's where your Homeland Security advisors are really pushing to get the Stafford Act to make more sense. You talk about basically the third rail of climate adaptation, which is, all of you are facing it, which is managed retreat. I mean, can you get people to move away from their communities? It's very hard to do. It's a last resort, but if we can get money and incentives to get people to do that, you know, people love their children and they want to protect them. But it's far off as a public policy right now. It's just very hard to do. But there are ways to incentivize, as I said, there's ways to incentivize more resiliency on an individual and community basis, which is what we're going to need to do. I should say, it shouldn't be that down on managed retreat. Post-Sandy, New York State did some interesting things in trying to get communities to rethink sort of how they were rebuilding and move away from areas. But where you have levers is in zoning laws or zoning rules and working with your localities in terms of their ordinances. I'm looking at my governor here. We have a seaport district. It will get flooded. Don't be surprised, right? We have zoning laws that do not allow for residents on the first floor. So it's a minor thing, but you know, it will make a difference to people's lives, right? I mean, if you can get people off the first floors, if a Starbucks goes out, no offense to Starbucks, we're okay, we'll live another day.
Thank you.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, really fascinating. Several of us here in this corner were in Congress a few years ago, and we had an issue of the pricing of flood insurance. And it was very controversial because the people living in dry areas were subsidizing people that were living in these flood-prone areas. You mentioned the pricing question a few minutes ago. Where do you see flood insurance at the national level? It affects the people in our communities. It doesn't affect the states so much in terms of our budgets, but.
So just quickly on this, the National Flood Insurance Program is underfunded and has been in debt. We are behind where the climate is taking us. In fact, in Vermont, I would guess most of those people do not have flood insurance. They were not in a flood zone. And so one of the reforms to think about that makes sense for an agnostic boom, right? We just don't know what's going to happen, is a national safety net of catastrophic or disaster insurance that will cover people who cannot get private insurance. That is going to me, that's the only long-term solution at this stage, because I can't predict the floods anymore, right? I mean, look at Vermont, until we get our mapping better.
Isn't that what the current program does essentially?
Just floods, though. It's not, it does that, but what you're starting to hear is a national disaster insurance program that would eventually replace floods, right? That how can you just look at floods now? It's wind, it's snow, it's heat. I mean, heat, right? You know, a book that, you know, my book is depressing. The book is called, you know, The Heat's Gonna Kill You First, is like, you know, this book that everyone's reading now. But so, yeah, so I think that is gonna be where we're gonna have to move, right?
That's your book too, The Heat's Gonna Kill You First?
I
You got
just
some
focus
books,
on the
I'll tell you.
devil, you know, but thank you.
All right, everybody, I'm told that the First Lady may be in the house, but I want to say, Juliette, thank you so much. And where you started on communication. I mean, I think all of us were on the front lines during COVID. Our job was sort of interpret what the CDC was saying back in the English so people understood it, and then take that to the local community level where you had mayors and religious leaders able to do that as well. And you can't over communicate in a crisis like that.
Hey, Ned, I wanted to thank Juliette on behalf of the NGA. I wanted to know when you're, as we close, I wanted to know when your sequel is coming out. Life Really Sucks.
You know, I'm a pretty happy person, because if you start your day thinking everything is going to be bad, generally it's a good day. So you just have to set your floor very low if you're me. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for what
Phil
you do.
Scott, are you still with us? Earth to
I
Phil,
am.
Earth to Phil.
I'm still there.
Shout him out.
There he is. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Good luck, Phil.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juliette.